Now we're going to hear from David Scola, who's the chief executive of Form, and if I understand, Form3, they may be able to help with that implementation problem we were just talking about, right?
What's that? Yeah, I mean, that was actually a great segue.
Yeah.
Thank you to the previous panel. So I want to thank everybody for sticking around at 4:15 on a Friday before Thanksgiving, and Kinfolks will have conversations later. But I do, as the slide says, I'm the chief exec for Form3 in the U.S. Just out of curiosity, who's heard of Form3? If you can raise your hand. Okay, remind me to talk to the marketing department on Monday. But I'll save the commercial for the end of the speech. We'll get a little bit into what we do. But just in terms of my background, prior to joining Form3 in January, I was the chief executive for Swift for the Americas. And prior to that, I ran Barclays Financial Institutions business. Before that, I worked for Deutsche for a long time. I'm not going to let you do the math, but it's been a while I've worked in payments. So I say all of that just to let you know that I am not coming to you as from the kind of techie perspective. I am coming to you as a previous practitioner, so I understand the pain that many of you are experiencing in dealing with all of the challenges that I think all of the panelists have done a great job of highlighting throughout the course of today. So just to get into that a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about why banks are moving to payment providers for their gateway connectivity. And specifically, just to clarify what that means is how they are connecting into the various payment schemes, whether it is the Fed or TCH or you name that payment scheme globally. Just to talk a little bit about what's motivating that, what the challenges are that the banks are facing. And I think, we've heard this throughout the course of today. First, there are the standards changes that are happening. ISO 20022 is a massive, massive undertaking for most institutions, particularly if you are truly taking advantage of the augmented data that it allows for. I think real-time payments is yet another one, as we've talked about throughout the course of today. And with that, and we'll get into a little bit more on that, but it's not just the fact that you're processing real-time payments. It's the liquidity questions that raises, the client access questions that raises, the infosec and fraud questions that raises. So those are all massive, massive undertakings. And I think associated with that is also, the second component of today's program, right, is the associated fraud. And we have seen huge upticks in fraud. I think everybody's familiar with Elizabeth Warren pointing out a couple of banks last week. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as the U.S. regulators and the U.S. politicians become cognizant of potential fraud. And frankly, I think it's impossible not to say, as Fed now rolls out, it will also be a prime target of fraudsters. And we've seen that in virtually every market where real-time payments have been rolled out. I think PIX in Brazil was referenced specifically earlier today, and some of the fraud challenges that are happening there. Added to these challenges, you have these old and outdated technology stacks that are very, very difficult to change, very, very complex, and in many cases very monolithic. So it's very difficult to kind of pull out a specific segment from your technology stack, replace it with a new shiny model when there's all kinds of reliances on that component throughout your system. And I think dealing with that old stack just highlights and exacerbates the scale of the lift that is needed to achieve to kind of, as you move towards real-time payments or any other kind of standards change that you have to deal with. It's also very difficult to plan for scalability, and it's also very difficult to benefit from advances that are being made in the fraud and infosec spaces because you're simply relying on the capacity of your own institution rather than the broader capacity of industry experts like the cloud providers, for instance, who spend more than any bank, I don't care what bank you are, could possibly spend on infosec and on their keeping their architecture safe. So, I touched on all these already, sorry. I think the other point that I didn't touch on is there are a number of things that every bank needs to do that is not a differentiating factor in their ability to compete with other banks, right? So every bank needs to connect to these payment systems, right? Every bank needs to maintain compliance with the regulations. There's very little proprietary value in how you do some of those core utility functions, yet they are massive consumers of your tech spend, right? Every year, I think every bank in here will agree that the vast majority of their tech spend is going to regulatory or mandatory upgrades and changes, right? And the necessary knock-on effect of that is that it limits your ability to invest in things like differentiating factors, like your client user interface, right? Like new product launches that you want to enact. So how the new CIOs are looking at their tech spend is they're looking to shift as much off the kind of capital expenditure side of the balance sheet and looking to put more and more on the operating expenditure. So effectively tying their operating expense to the revenue that they are able to generate with the launch of these new products. So I think that is also leading many banks to look at partnering with fintechs and other providers, cloud providers as well, to try and offset as much of that expense and associate it with new revenue as much as possible. So there is a new approach. Yes, there's a Dilbert commercial. I thought I needed at 4:15 on a Friday. And I'm fully aware that when we speak to a lot of our clients, this is the reaction that they're giving. Blah, 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 cloud, blah, 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 platform. Yeah, we've heard it all before, right? And it's true. And I think what is changing, frankly, is what banks are comfortable now contemplating about putting on the cloud. So it used to be, there's no way we're going to put core platform on the cloud. We're seeing more and more banks moving their core platform either to public cloud, proprietary cloud, or a hybrid of the two. All right. We would have heard for years, there's no way we'd move our payments processing to the cloud, right? I can tell you right now, we have 50% of the faster payments market in the UK operating on public cloud through our platform, and I'll get to that in a minute, right? But that openness to start considering how you move or what you move to the cloud, I think has changed drastically. And I think the use of public cloud for that, right, is becoming more and more popular. And for all the reasons that I mentioned before, right, the economies of scale, the ability to leverage their InfoSec capabilities, the ability to not have to worry about hardware upgrades and just shift all of that onus onto others whose core capability is exactly that. I think the other big shift, I mentioned before the kind of monolithic architecture that we've seen in banking systems in the past, right? Where you went to one provider and they kind of sold you an end-to-end system, and that made it very difficult to pick and choose kind of best of breed. I hate that term. Best in the market providers for the discrete components that are actually comprising your client journey, right? You're going to one person who's selling you this kind of soup to nuts solution. I think that's become incredibly restrictive, and the evolution of APIs and microservices has allowed banks to be far more flexible in how they compose the elements that make up that client journey and interlace them very easily using APIs. And we're seeing more and more banks start to look at building components of that architecture themselves. Again, those that they think are of proprietary value, that are differentiating from a client perspective, and then picking and choosing from a menu of different providers of where they can get the best bang for the buck to solve for those specific areas of the client journey. And I think, it's pretty evident now, the shift. When I was at Barclays, I remember the big threat, the fintechs were going to take over the world. Now the fintech bank, relationship is far more evolved than that. I think you see far more partnerships happening in the space, and a realization that there's enough space for both to play and indeed to kind of augment each other's services. So what does a new architecture look like in this environment? So little secret, I just removed the Form3 logo from the top of this page, but I think you could pretty much use this for anybody who's kind of composing this type of new architecture. So you have all of your customer systems, the user interfaces on the left-hand side, those feeding into the core banking systems, and then the integration via API to the outside world. And I think it's that piece, right, that we focus on primarily, which is, basically removing the need to maintain connectivity to all of these different providers. All of these different payment systems, and managing the change that is, and the maintenance that is required to integrate with all of those, right? So as Fedwire goes to move to an ISO 20022 migration, you can rely on a third-party provider to handle that migration. You may need to allow access to other data components via the API for the provider to consume that data and compose that payment, but it's not going to require a wholesale change of your back systems. It's still, you're kind of insulated from that. By that same token, as FedNow is launched, one of the big questions is how do you orchestrate payments between FedNow and TCH RTP? Not everybody's going to be accessible via both or either. There's going to be, I think, a number of banks that are effectively being looked to bridge that gap between the two platforms. And I think that requires a level of payment orchestration in this layer that is very difficult to achieve in other architectures. By that same token, SWIFT moving to 20022, and I think banks looking to also follow their client journeys, right? It becomes much easier to leverage the likes of a third-party provider as you look to follow particularly your corporate clients. And we see this all the time in the US, right? Where you have local bank, great relationship with a large corporate. That large corporate says, hey, I'm thinking of doing some business in India. Can you help me there? No, I can't, sorry. And all of a sudden they're migrating to one of the large global banks and the relationship is lost, right? I'm not saying it's necessarily easy to help to solve for that journey, but this can help certainly solve for at least one component, which is the connectivity piece into the local payment markets. So I think I recognize this is nothing new. You guys have heard kind of components of this throughout the day. I do think it's important to kind of articulate it in kind of a single strategy, though, and we are seeing it is more of a reassurance that there are banks who are going through this journey, who are making the leap to put more and more of their core processing into the cloud, and I think we will continue to see that dynamic continue for some time. Sorry, am I over?